And if you follow a lot of the UFO incidents involving the U.S. military, you might have seen a lot of people talking about several videos of what looks like a triangle seeming to hover over a base out at 29 Palms here in California.
There were over a dozen witnesses that had seen the progress of this low-flying black triangle that had appeared.
As I was walking back from Mom's house to our house, I just looked up and there was a giant black triangle in the sky.
What's that in the sky over West Texas? What's that in the sky over Kansas? A group that might be called the Interceptor Club watches everything military that flies over. But back in March, they spotted 3 craft they'd never seen before, about 6 miles up.
We had captured something completely unique.
A triangle, like a stealth bomber, but not a stealth bomber.
The back edge was flat, like a Dorito. It wasn't jagged.
A few weeks later, the same shape was snapped by another spotter in Kansas.
A German airman is trying out his novel machine at Cologne. It is in effect a pair of rigid wings without body or tail.
Since human history began, people have been seeing weird stuff in the sky. But I'm interested in a particular period. Between 1960 and the early 2000s, there seemed to be a trend of people seeing a large black triangle. Sometimes these would have 3 lights, 1 on each corner. Sometimes they would have a central large light. Sometimes they'd have no lights at all and just be a silhouette. This is a speculative investigation of mine into the theory that some of these may not be anomalous. They may well be human-made military vehicles. I've had this theory for a while based on some of the cases that I'm going to bring up in this video, and it would seem that there are sources on the internet which agree, and therefore I thought this would be a nice chance to collate that and present it to you for you to form your own opinions. I would be fascinated to know what you think, and if you've got any evidence that works for or against this, that's all constructive, and I'd love to hear that in the comments. So hope you enjoy it. It's mainly for entertainment, and let's get into it. On the 2nd of August 1990, 9-year-old Tom was glued to the TV as the Allied forces went into battle in Iraq at the start of the First Gulf War. But on top of the Fighting Falcons, Eagles, Tomcats and Tornadoes, a new very peculiar plane had entered the modern battlefield. This was the F-117 Nighthawk, or the stealth fighter as we know it today. Now we're going to be coming back to this later, but for now I want to focus on its primary armament, which was the laser-guided bomb. Now we were told by the BBC at the time that this weapon would be deployed in the following way. That a ground team of special forces, whether it be the SAS or Delta Force or whoever, would have a laser designator and would paint the intended target with an infrared beam. This would then allow the bomber or weapons delivery platform to come in, release its payload and deliver democracy with laser guided accuracy. However, having your laser designator on the floor has a suite of problems that come with it. First of all, you're nearer the target and therefore nearer the danger. And secondly, in a densely packed area, you're going to struggle to have line of sight to your target, forcing you to get closer to it, which may put you in harm's way from the very bombs that you're calling in yourself. This then highlighted a clear niche for an air-based laser designation platform that could enter an area very quickly, utilize stealth technology to remain undetected, linger for a long time and paint as many targets down on the ground as possible, and then exit the battlefield very quickly should it become under attack or detected by enemy radar. Now for this, we need to go back to 1975, when DARPA put out a contract to all the leading aviation suppliers and manufacturers for a project prototype known as the Hopeless Diamond. This was a stealth-based, a very angular craft which gave birth eventually to the B-2 bomber and the F-117 Nighthawk. The first flight of the Nighthawk was June 18th, 1981. The first flight of the B-2 was 17th of July 1989. However, this technology had been developed well before this, as a spy was captured in 1984 for trying to sell triangular stealth documents to the Russians. It's also worth noting that the development of the B-2 was known as Project Aurora, so this is the only time in this video that I'm actually going to mention the TR-3B or the Aurora, because I feel we make a grave mistake in throwing that name TR-3B at any triangular thing that we see in the sky. It's like calling any car that goes past a Corvette just because we know what one looks like, and I feel it leads to over-speculation and kind of takes away from the more interesting part of the study itself. The early 90s saw a wave of black triangular UFOs being reported over major population centres in the UK, earning them nicknames of things like the Dudley Dorito. There was also a sighting at RAF Cosford, which has become quite infamous. Staff there reported seeing something Star Destroyer sized, which was the shape of a diamond and hovered over the main runway for some time in the early evening before flying off with enormous velocity. Now, what these places have in common is they were all used as US Air Force staging posts, particularly hosts for their nuclear capable B-52s and large bombers, as they had large runways. This leads us to perhaps the most famous black triangle sighting of all time. In 1990, Kevin Russell, a hotel worker from Perthshire in Scotland, was out hiking with a friend in the hills over Calvine when he saw what he reported to be a 100-foot wide black triangular UFO being harassed by an RAF Harrier jump jet. He managed to take 4 photographs of this as it hovered in place for 10 minutes before flying off with incredible velocity out of his sight. He submitted these photographs to the Ministry of Defence with his report of the unusual sighting. Nothing was then heard until 2 years ago, when they declassified this report and released the one remaining photograph. The other 3 were apparently lost. The one that remained was pinned up on the wall behind Nick Pope, an RAF staff member's desk. Now, I've saved my favourite one until last because despite there not being a photograph attached, this in my opinion is from the most credible observer, with a witness, and showing a direct link to the US Air Force. So in 1989, on the oil rig Galveston Key, Chris Gibson was called to the observation deck by a colleague who had seen an unusual collection of planes in the sky. He called Chris because Chris was a member of the Royal Observer Corps, which is a civil defence unit trained to identify and observe planes in the sky for defence purposes by the MOD. In Chris's report, he mentioned seeing a KC-135 Stratotanker, which was a US Air Force plane used for mid-flight refuelling. However, from the type of engines, he identified it as the Q variant, which had been used previously to refuel the SR-71 Blackbird. It was flanked by 2 F-111 swing-wing bombers, but was in the process of refueling a large black triangle at very high altitude. At that time, the RAF didn't have many planes that were capable of breaking the sound barrier, let alone reason to, over UK airspace, and therefore it left a mysterious question mark as to the true culprit. On the subject of the Blackbird, it was officially retired in January of 1990, with no successor ever formally announced. This was just a couple of weeks after Chris had his sighting of this black object in the sky. Also, the reason for its retirement officially was due to mounting maintenance costs. Keeping the most powerful plane ever conceived in the sky was an incredibly costly endeavour, but it also wasn't without its shortcomings. For example, the minimum turning circle of the SR-71 was 80 nautical miles. It was built to be so fast, with such low drag, that it struggled to turn and manoeuvre in the air. Also worth mentioning, at this time where most scientific and technological innovations were recorded in magazines like Jane's Defence Weekly and Modern Mechanics published this article about the possibility that there was a new stealth replacement for the Blackbird being used in the Gulf. Also in 1989, Ertl, who was a die-cast toy manufacturer known for making extremely detailed recreations of modern fighter planes, released this, which was their F-19 Stealth. Now, to be honest, I'm only bringing this up because I had one as a kid and I absolutely adored it. I used to go running around the garden with it, occasionally falling on it and causing myself grievous injuries. But upon seeing Top Gun 2 with the Lockheed Dark Star, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between this incredibly fast Mach 10 plane and the toy that I'd injured myself with repeatedly as a child. Hello pals, it's me, from the future, of this video at least. So, quite a lot has happened in the 6 months since I first made this video. And I want to share it with you, and it's worthy. That's one of the reasons that I'm doing these remasters, is because first of all the audio was rubbish on the original one, but secondly a lot more information has come to light since I put this video out, and it's so frustrating to know that something's incomplete or not done to the best of my ability. So anyway, before I get into the information, just allow me to be quite patronizing for a second and share something which was quite important to me. So I think it's really important, if you're investigating a faith or a religion or a science or a technology or any other thing where you're trying to increase your understanding of something unknown, that your primary goal is to have your conclusions shattered and updated. That's healthy. That's good science. That should be the goal of every scientist, is that at some point in the future I'm going to be out of date because the science will be better and will be at a more elevated level of knowledge. Now, when I first made this video 6 months ago now, I was under the impression that there was one black project which was hypersonic with a high linger time. And since making the video, first of all, it was really bugging me that, for starters, it's quite practical to make something super duper fast. We've seen that with the Blackbird, the X-15, that kind of thing. But the sacrifice of that is your linger time, your fuel consumption. They usually need a very long runway because they don't create a lot of lift. Counter to that is it's practical to make something with a long linger time, or that can take off vertically, something like the Harrier. But they pay for that with a low top speed usually, because to create a lot of lift you've either got to be geared for it engine wise, like the Harrier, which can blow its engine out the bottom, or something like a balloon, which can hover for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, but really can't do much in the way of transverse horizontal movement. So Occam's razor says that rather than look for one craft, it might be healthy to look for two. And then when I started to have that mindset, a lot of things made a lot more sense. So, for example, the Calvine craft is a fat diamond shape. And we've since had the opportunity, via the legendary Jimmy on the UAP files, to speak to Nick Pope, who investigated this, and he said that it did move off at high speed. It whizzed off, was his exact words, but it wasn't sort of implying any hypersonic behavior, and it was at a very low level. Whereas the craft that Chris Gibson saw, which was more of a pointy triangle, sharp edge thing, was very high altitude and being fed by the exact same tanker that supplied the Blackbird. So that implies two different craft. Now, key piece of evidence was the UK Condign report, which was a study into UFOs carried out between 1997 and the year 2000. Now, this was done separately to the RAF, so I'm not going to bash Nick Cook for this because he wasn't aware of its creation or conception. But that, when you have a look at it, has got an entire section dedicated to NATO, so basically US craft that were operating over UK skies at the time. And it's got the F-22 Raptor, and don't forget this is 1997, so there were Raptors in the air then. It's got a thermodynamic thing which kind of looks like a flying saucer. It's really weird. It's got the Blackbird, the SR-71, but there are two vehicles or projects which are blacked out, further feeding the legitimacy of thinking that there are two specific types of craft. So that's interesting. And then after making this video, I did a video on the wonderful and dearly missed Mark McCandlish, who, rather than me go into that, I mean, judging from how many people have seen it, you've probably seen it already, but he was a concept artist, did a lot of work for Lockheed Martin, and long story short, one of his very good friends got into a private air show display that he shouldn't have, was not qualified to be at, and he saw Lockheed's Project Aurora, which was a far more streamlined, basically shaped like that, with, I think it was 4 engines on the back, pulse detonation engines, and it was unmanned. It kind of looked a bit like Flight of the Navigator's craft when it's in sort of super speed mode, and looked a lot more like the one that Chris Gibson saw. Without going into too much detail, because I do in the Mark McCandlish video, I have total confidence that that meeting took place, and even more confidence in Mark's ability to recreate the craft that his friend and colleague witnessed, as they were both incredibly detailed, technically accurate gents in that field. So now we've got a lot more evidence of the fact that this Project Aurora, and you'll see on this document, which was NASA's funding of high altitude craft for testing different technologies, Generation 1 was actually sponsored by the Ministry of Defense, which is very interesting. But that looks a lot like the Chris Gibson craft, and then that makes a lot more room for a considerably lower tech, big diamond shaped, long loiter time craft that could have been this infrared designator as spotted at Calvine. And that makes a lot more sense to me in conclusion. So there we go, a bit of food for thought. It's worth pointing out as a final note that by the end of the early 2000s and into the 2010s, satellite surveillance had completely taken over from aircraft-based surveillance programs. Why bother risking having your incredibly expensive plane flying over enemy territory, perhaps without permission, when you can just have the whole thing surveilled from space without triggering any radars or observations from people on the ground? Just as a final thinking point, I'd also like to bring up Calvine once more. Now, the UK government and Ministry of Defence are incredibly ruthless with their secrecy regarding the UFO phenomena. Very recently, almost every reported case and investigation has had its classification extended for another 80 years. Why then, a couple of years ago, would they dig up a 30-year-old photograph of a black triangle, declassify it, and hand it to the public? Perhaps it's because it's an out-of-date military concept, which, by talking about that, allows them to draw attention from the truly unidentifiable flying objects. I'll leave that to you to decide. And so that brings us to the end of this speculative investigation into the black triangle phenomenon. I'm not going to give you any further conclusions because, frankly, I don't feel like the data's there to support it. I just felt like there was enough interesting information to make a video and let you form your own opinion afterwards. So which do you think's more plausible? That some extraterrestrial advanced civilization has come here in a triangular craft to hang out over Dudley and the West Midlands and see what we're up to? Or that our own military has developed an incredibly exotic craft which we've perhaps now mothballed because the need for it has ended? Bit of both?
Bit of both.